In this video we compare the Tiger and the IS-2. But here we don't look at the usual suspects, namely armor, firepower and mobility, but we look at doctrine, organization and other soft factors. For instance, were the IS-2 units also intended to fight against tanks as the Tiger unit were? To answer this question, we asked Peter Tank Archive Samsonov, who looked into Soviet sources of the time. He published a book with us about the IS-2, which you can get at the following link or on Amazon.
So, people really like to compare tanks. I also do. I'm guilty as charged. And the question is, of course, sometimes, is it a dumb comparison? For instance, comparing the IS-2 with the Tiger. And here we want to look more on the soft factors and the big picture. So generally, if we look at the first of the role, because I know that for the Tiger, I looked into the pamphlets for the company and the battalion, and they specifically mention the tank killer role. That's very important that it is used where there's a lot of enemy tanks, because one of the main goals is to destroy a lot of tanks. Now, if I look at the IS-2, what I read at least is that for the loadout with ammunition, it generally states 20 shots for HE and only 8 for armor piercing. Then again, I know that the 120mm HE can also be quite devastating if it hits a tank. So, so in terms of the tank killer role, was this part of the IS-2 doctrine idea, or was it a minor thing, or was it completely ignored?
It was definitely not completely ignored. It was but it was secondary. So in documents that I have about how to use IS-2, they're usually rolled in the IS-2, the IS-1, ISU-152, ISU-122. The instructions are rolled in together because they're very similar in terms of their application. But those instructions say that on the offensive, IS tanks and ISU SPGs travel in the first echelon and destroy enemy fortifications. That's what they do. They have, if they need to be protected from enemy tanks, there's a screen of medium tanks that covers their flanks. At the same time, the anti-tank abilities of these tanks are definitely not ignored. There are extensive trials against, Panther, Tiger, Ferdinand, whatever you could find, right? How does the D25 affect it? How does the ML20 affect it? How do our heavy tanks fight enemy heavy tanks, right? And there are separate anti-tank, they were even called heavy anti-tank brigades, which contain regiments of IS-2 tanks and the ISU-122 SPGs. Which themselves are not anti-tank units, they're breakthrough units, but put together they form anti-tank brigades. So yeah, while this was not a primary role, this was by no means was it ignored, and it does say explicitly that when operating in the vicinity of enemy heavy tanks, you can actually just operate with medium tanks and keep your own heavy tank assets in reserve as an anti-tank reserve.
Now, in terms of pursuit mission, basically when the enemy is broken and that you follow up and try to pursue him, is this mentioned because the Tiger pamphlet specifically mentioned it's specifically suited for pursuit, Verfolgung?
Oh, that's so surprising. I would not expect Tigers to be suited for pursuit. Medium tanks are used in pursuit. So pamphlets dating back to before the war explicitly say that. Well, before the war, BT tanks would be used for exploitation roles. Afterwards, T-34s would be used for exploitation roles. It was definitely acknowledged that heavy tanks are harder to drive, more fuel intensive, more maintenance intensive. They don't last as long. So 1944, you should have a T-34 driving 2,000 kilometers before refurbishment. And then an IS-2 like 1,500, probably less, depending on terrain or how often you have time to do preventative maintenance. But it's going to be significantly less, and so for these long range especially independent actions like a breakthrough, you don't really have infantry coming with you. You're not going to use heavy tanks at all. The other reason is that IS-2 regiments only had a single company of submachine gunners for close defense, and also engineers, platoon of engineers, and that's it. So these are units that are attached to some other bigger thing, usually a tank brigade or a infantry division, which has its own organic infantry assets, its own anti-air, its own, signals and everything else. You really don't want to throw something like that into a breach, into a breakthrough exploitation or pursuit role. Whereas a tank brigade full of medium tanks, it has its own motorized infantry. It has its own anti-tank assets, limited anti-tank assets, but it has them, right? It has its own anti-aircraft. So a tank brigade or even a tank corps with medium tanks do much better suited for that kind of role.
Now, in terms of prohibited missions, to quote here, basically, it is forbidden, verboten, to give Tiger missions that can be fulfilled by light tanks or Sturmgeschütze. Additionally, it is not used for recon or security missions. Now, the last part is, I think, quite obvious. What I find really interesting, which can also be fulfilled by Sturmgeschütze. So is this similar with the IS-2? Or is this something mentioned along those lines, or...
I have not seen anything like that. I think it's just because the roles, the closest equivalent to a Sturmgeschütze in the Red Army would be Su-76. So the direct fire support of infantry. But the IS-2 and the Su-76 are so radically different in terms of ability that I don't think anybody would even consider using an IS-2 for that. The one thing that Soviet pamphlets explicitly prohibit over and over and over and over again is splitting up heavy tank units. So a regiment's 21 tanks. It's your striking power. It's your spearhead. It's one fist that you need to strike with. And I think it's kind of a reaction to the early days of the war where, a tank division would arrive somewhere and the combined arms commander would go, oh, awesome, I'm going to take this regiment and put it there. And then the lower ranked combined arms commander says, oh, sweet, a tank regiment, I'm going to take this battalion, right? I'm going to take this platoon, I'm going to take this company. And so you had individual tanks being sent out as reconnaissance just kind of somewhere over there, and entire divisions would just disappear. Never having, before coming into contact with the enemy, they would lose cohesion and just vanish. And so there was a really big swing of the pendulum the other way, saying that absolutely not, under any circumstances, can, these tanks operate as even companies, even single units. It's a regiment, it fights as a regiment, that's it.
Was there a term for this in Russian? Because for the Germans, it's always Geschlossener Einsatz, and I wrote, I think, 2 or 3 pages on how to translate that word and the different attempts and how we failed. Because for the Germans, it's always like Geschlossener Einsatz for the tanks, and it's particularly ironic because they also write it for the Jagdpanther, and then the first time the Jagdpanther was sent into combat, as far as I know, it was also sent in piecemeal. So it's quite this irony.
There's a number of terms that I've seen, some more obscene than others. The most acceptable one, I would say, is раздергивание, so to pull apart, to pick apart.
The Germans have a positive term, basically. Geschlossener Einsatz, which means you could, if you do a literal translation, it's closed employment, so closed in the sense that you take the whole unit. And we tried with the negative definition would be not in piecemeal, basically, which doesn't capture it. So there's no equivalent in that part. Now, what I find interesting that you mentioned the Su-76, because in my opinion, the Su-76 has no equivalent in the German and also British my British, I might be wrong because I don't know them well, and American in the US Army, basically. Because the general approach seems to be it's a multi-purpose gun. I mean, of course, in the German anti-tank guns can also fire HE, but they do it in a different way. And I also know a German report from late war where they tried to use the PaK-40 in the way the Soviets use the SIS-3. So also use it for artillery. And they say, okay, this doesn't work because the guns are basically worn out when you want to use it for anti-tank duties. And basically the SIS-3, although many see it as an anti-tank gun, was a multi-purpose gun because the SIS-2 was basically a dedicated anti-tank gun. So I also see this with the Su-76. It has no real equivalent. And I think there we can go back to the comparison between the IS-2 and the Tiger because it's just doesn't add up. I mean, if you look at the ammunition loadout, the IS-2 has 28 shots in total. The Tiger has 92. Of course, I mean, the IS-2 has a bigger gun, but that whole setup. And also in terms of organization, as you mentioned, the regiment has 21 tanks. A German heavy tank battalion has 45 heavy tanks in it. And they are used in a similar way that they are attached to a division or a bigger formation that they achieve a specific purpose. So in organization and philosophy, we have some general overlap, but sometimes if you look directly at the technology, like at the ammunition, it's quite different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the things that always strikes me when I'm reading Schneider's books with the combat diaries is that, correct me if I'm wrong, but the heavy tank battalions very rarely fight as one. It's always, first company is somewhere over there, second company is somewhere over there, comp group is something or other with 3 of our tanks is something, doing something there, and it's like spread out over this huge terrain, which I don't think Soviet commander is going to lose his head if he says, oh yeah, I sent, because IS-2 company is 5 tanks, a platoon is 2 tanks, I sent an IS-2 platoon, over there to do something. No, you're never gonna get IS-2 tanks again if you perform that. But the most interesting thing was that there's an instruction. I've never seen the German original. I've seen it translated into English that says lone Tiger tanks should not engage in IS-2. Which to me
very specific.
It's very specific, but to me, it then also suggests that the Germans were employing lone Tiger tanks in some kind of role.
I have a file with basically all the complaints by the Panzerwaffe when their tanks were used wrongly, and they are really like that. One guy sent one Tiger alone, and we lost it because there was no security for it, and the other was like. And there was one, and sadly I couldn't find the quote again because I wanted to quote it. And it was basically an infantry commander told a tank officer basically, it takes Germany 1 or 2 years to build a tank or 6 months, but it takes Germany 18 years to build a grenadier.
Mm-hmm.
Or an infantryman, because they changed the name from rifleman to grenadier at one point in the war, which particularly makes it interesting if you have a rifle grenade man, because then you call him grenadier if you translate him, or something along those lines. But anyway, so yeah, there was this issue, and always this like Geschlossener Einsatz, don't use them in piecemeal, again and again. You see it all the time, and often there is the indication that, okay, they are not following it for reasons. And of course, one is that they're always like firemen at the front. Mm-hmm. Like they had this. What was for the tank divisions were basically the Korsettstangen. A corset is how you call with women it's basically they hold together the front line. So basically these are the
string, lace.
No. A corset is when you have like these.
A corset, yeah.
Corset. Okay, so on Stangen are basically the hard parts in a corset. The
ribs
or something, yeah. Basically, the tank division are the ribs in the corset, and the infantry divisions are basically the weaker or the soft part of the corset.
There's some poets writing German tank manuals. I don't think
No,
I've seen
it's
anything.
I'm not sure if it's a World War. I think it's a World War II term. I've never seen it in a manual, but if you talk to a German historian of the Second World War, basically if you mention Korsettstangen, then they know you're talking about tank divisions, basically along those lines. So
Interesting. Yeah, I think the Red Army just had its hands full of this kind of behavior in 1941, and it took extreme measures to curb it. There were still, of course, issues with infantry and tank cooperation. There's always going to be, but this kind of temptation to take a single tank and send it out somewhere was stamped out relentlessly. Yeah, another interesting things in that note that I saw was it called to forget any kind of idea that a Tiger is invulnerable, because it straight up says, the Russians have, I think they say something like a 5 centimeter gun, which I think they might say it means this too, and like the English have a 9 centimeter gun. So I guess the 94 millimeter AA gun or the 3.7 inch, right? And you say there's all these weapons out there that Tigers cannot be considered invulnerable anymore. And I don't think that the Red Army ever considered any of its tanks invulnerable. There wasn't that, hazards like splash or mobility kills or whatnot, like mission kills were very strictly highlighted in training and in crew operation.
Pamphlet that specifically states, okay, the Tiger can't be considered invulnerable anymore, or I'm not sure if it's worded exactly that way, but they basically then list all the penetration values they have, and they also state we need to rely on basic tank tactics now, again, like we used previously. But the interesting thing is that for the Tiger, they issued a pamphlet for the company and for the battalion. But it specifically states that the manual for the company, for the medium company, from May 1941, which was for the Panzer IV with the short belt gun, is the basis for these two pamphlets. This is the one we translated. And they specifically mentioned in this one that the lowest unit you use to employ would be a platoon, and the platoon would be 4 tanks. So generally, or for the light companies, basically, it would be 5 tanks. So German platoon is 5 and then later on the medium with the Panzer IV with the long belt and with the Panther is also 5 tanks. But the Tiger and for the medium in 1941, it's 4 tanks. And they specifically mentioned that you use a half a platoon only in rare instances, like in a forest, I think. Yeah, I think there's 1 or 2 examples in the regulation where they state they use but a tank alone is basically a no-go, and I think it might be specifically mentioned. So I find it kind of odd that a manual also or an experience report would state don't go alone against an IS tank, because you shouldn't do this in the first place. But then again, it really depends what it was and what experience. I assume it was an experience report or something along those lines.
Yeah, I mean, there's always going to be a difference between what should be and what is.
Yeah.
There's a document. There's a British composition of POW interrogations. I had in hand. I can't remember what it said something also about employing half platoons or even the POWs. You were complaining to the British that their commanders were employing half platoons and single tanks. So yeah, it was definitely an issue. But yeah, this would be considered unthinkable, and I'm sure there's some kind of harsh language. You'd be called the Trotskyist saboteur, or Esser wrecker, or some choice words from Commissar's vocabulary for doing something like that.
So going back to the original question, comparing the IS-2 with the Tiger, is it a dumb comparison, or does it make sense, or what is your verdict now?
I think it makes sense. They are both heavy tanks in specialized units designed for this kind of tank. They're assigned to a larger formation for the execution of a special mission. Now, the things like ammo loadout, the precise nature of that mission, those were different, but that's because, these are two different armies with two different kinds of vehicles doing different things. So this is a good example that, you can compare and contrast and make larger conclusions about how these two armies treated their heavy tanks and their tanks in general.
I would say that the comparison has merits if one accounts for the context, and also, for instance, uses it. I mean, I often do technical and tactical comparisons, so really the single tanks against each other, but I generally try to put it in a bigger context and also show, okay, here are the differences, and here this is how the Red Army approached it, and this is how the German Army approached it, that to provide a wider education or more context, that it gets beyond basically rivet counting.
Mm-hmm.
And so to serve that educational purpose and also a better understanding, because for me, when I looked at the Su-76, I was like, yeah, this doesn't really have an equivalent. This is not a tank destroyer, as the Germans labeled it, and as I thought for a long time. No, it's something of something I can't really grasp, and I'm still trying to wrap my head to a certain degree around.
Well, it's an infantry support gun with anti-tank capability. But yeah, definitely, I agree that if you just take tanks and compare them, in an Excel spreadsheet based on numbers, that's a pointless comparison. I've seen people try and compare the IS-2 and the Panther because they weigh about the same. Okay, that doesn't really mean anything. They're vastly different tanks. They're included in different units. They're used for different purposes. So definitely, the whatever in the millimeters or kilograms assigned to each individual tank rarely matter as much as strategy and doctrine, and not having your combined arms commander who came out of officer school yesterday say, "Great tanks, okay, drive into that forest."
I find it funny that you mentioned the Panther and the IS-2 because they have the same weight. I recently did a video comparing the Vespa with the M7 Priest, and some people complained why I should have compared the Priest with the Hummel because they have about the same weight. And I said, nope, because the one is heavy artillery and the other one is basically light artillery. And the Vespa and Priest are both light artillery. So it's all about, and the organization and everything else, because the Hummel has no real equivalent in the US Army, because there are some self-propelled guns that have a heavy artillery gun similar, but they are not organic to the armored divisions, whereas the Vespa and Priest and Hummel were all organic to the divisions. Mm-hmm. But that, again, this is where the organization comes in, which is often ignored. And is very important.
If you want to compare the Jagdpanther to the ISU-122, by all means, they're both heavy tank destroyers, right? But the IS-2 and the Panther are very different vehicles.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for watching, and see you next time. Bye.